Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to today's roundtable event sponsored by the School of Politics and Global Studies here at ASU. My name is Victor Peskin. I'm associate professor in the school and the chair of our colloquium and speakers committee this year. Today's event on the rise of anti-democratic violence in the US, perspectives on the Capitol insurrection could not be more timely. Just 35 days ago, the nation watched as thousands of rioters seeking to block the certification of the 2020 presidential election stormed the US Capitol building in an attack that led to the deaths of 5 people, shook our democracy, and shocked many worldwide. This Tuesday marked the beginning of the second impeachment trial of Donald Trump, who stands accused of inciting the insurrection against the US government, an insurrection that included extremist groups and white supremacists. Today's roundtable event, featuring four of our school's professors, aims to make sense not only of what occurred in Washington, D.C. on January 6th, but also the recent rise in extremism and anti-democratic and racist violence in the US. Before introducing our 4 panelists, I would just like to invite everyone to another upcoming event that also examines the issue of extremism and anti-democratic violence. And this will be an event featuring former Arizona Senator Jeff Flake, who will be in conversation with Dr. Gina Woodall, who's a senior lecturer in our department. It's on March 15th from noon to 1, and we hope you'll join us then. Matt Oxford has just put in the chat an invitation and a link. And thank you, Matt, for all your help in organizing both events. Now I'd like to briefly introduce our 4 panelists who will each speak for between 5 and 10 minutes. First, I'd like to introduce Lenka Bustakova, who's an associate professor of political science and a comparativist who recently published a book on radical right mobilization in Eastern Europe. And next, Jennet Kirkpatrick, who is also an associate professor of political science and a political theorist. Her diverse scholarship includes a book on the role of violence and terrorism in the exercise of democratic ideals in America. Next, I'd like to turn to Fabian Neuner, who is an assistant professor in our school and is an expert on political behavior, political psychology, and political opinion in the US and in comparative contexts. And finally, like to introduce Candace Rondeaux, who is a Washington, D.C. based professor of practice in our school as well, and a senior fellow with the ASU Center on the Future of War. She's an expert on US and international security affairs and has had a distinguished, and she's been a distinguished journalist, including for the Washington Post. And Candace is not here with us yet, I think, but hopefully she'll be joining us shortly. So I'd like to go in alphabetical order and start with Professor Bustakova, who will speak to us first. And thank you all to our panelists and to the many in attendance. And we have 83 people in attendance so far. So thank you so much. Lenka.
Thank you, Victor, for a wonderful introduction. It's a great pleasure to join my colleagues here. I just want to make 3 brief points before we open it up to discussion. And I will focus on sort of the more comparative aspect of the US insurrection. So first, I want to highlight that we have seen similar insurrections in Europe in the past few years. So the US case sort of, is following up on these examples. Second, I just want to emphasize or bring attention to the fact that the far-right ideology is a global movement today. And then I want to wrap up by thinking about sort of having some thoughts about the middle class and backsliding again in comparative perspective. So in past few years, we have seen the far right extremely emboldened, both in the United States and in Europe. For example, in July 2021, about 38,000 far right protesters stormed the German parliament. Similar to the US, the police was unprepared and shocked. They didn't get in. About 300 were arrested, and these people protested against restrictions to curb the spread of coronavirus. But their target was the Reichstag, the German parliament. In Netherlands, since 2019, angry farmers, often led by far-right movements, have been destroying government offices and threatening politicians. In 2006, the prelude of the far-right Jobbik party stormed the television and headquarters and engaged in fights in the streets. And there are many aspects to these movements, but they certainly express anger against the so-called political establishment. They also demonstrate their ability for collective action, and the fact that they they I would say in if you sort of study the far-right mobilization in past few years, I think we live in an era when we see that the far-right is emboldened to take actions of of this sort. So that's new, and the US follows this wonderful trend. Second, I just wanted to point out the fact that the far-right ideology is a global movement. Of course, every country has its own idiosyncrasies, but for example, the QAnon is a US phenomenon, but the protocols of the Elders of the Zion is one of the most impactful conspiracy theories that was published in 1903. The Tsarist officials were involved in the fabricate. It was a bestseller right away. In 1920, Henry Ford bought 500,000 copies and have it spread in the United States. And recently we had a workshop organized by the Jewish Center and one of the presenters, Jeff Kopstein, sort of found that there is a very strong relationship between QAnon supporters and anti-Semitism. And so, the QAnon is specific and has its, own twist, but ultimately it is a global conspiracy theory, and there is, nothing new about it. The attack on the US Capitol incredibly emboldened far-right movements across the world. I study Ukraine, and I just want to read a quote that, one day after the insurgency, the leader of a violent nationalist movement, Azov, Sergei Korotkin, wrote on social media, reflecting on the US events, and quote, "The whites have turned to decisive action and captured the capital. That's good. Even though it may lead to nothing, it gives a chance, I believe. The whites are still here and know what to do." So for example, the Azov movement, most of you probably have never heard about it, but it was a paramilitary movement, fights in Donbass and in the east. But the US has been sort of debating recently whether to put it on the list of foreign terrorist organizations. One of the reasons, and this is very contested because it's difficult to get information, but there is certainly some evidence that the Azov movement trains far-right militias from Germany and from some of the other countries, and there is some journalistic evidence that links them to the Rise Above movement, and that some of which is an American neo-Nazi movement from Southern California. They, obviously because they're from California, they emphasize fitness among other things. But there have been some links between the German neo-Nazi movements who come to Donbass and get training, and they have recruited other far-right activists from Serbia, Czech Republic, and other countries. Not to mention the fact that obviously this is particular to languages. The global conspiracy movement, circulates in social media. In each country has its own variations, but ultimately, there are few overlapping themes that resonate well in other countries across the world. Finally, I want to make a point about the middle class and what we call backsliding. When we think about people, we don't have a survey about who stormed the US Capitol, but I think we should seriously reconsider how do we view sort of middle class and their role in preservation of democratic values. The neo-Nazi movement had a broad support among the lower middle classes. The first when Orban rose to power, he first activated upper middle classes, intellectuals, socially conservative intellectuals through civic circles. And they, sort of at the moment when he rose to power in 2010, they were instrumental in, in its electoral, in its ability to win the elections. That does not mean that the far right doesn't appeal to the poor voters, but what we know from our studies is that the economic considerations are not the primary drivers of far right movements. They are important, they can, facilitate certain things, but it is about identity politics, and a lot of middle class supporters, of course, are parts of the far right movements. In Europe, the biggest facilitator of backsliding has been the European People's Party, which is a party of the conservative right that needs sort of Orban in the European Parliament, but has been really protecting him all way. And so my last thought that there are a lot of theories in social sciences that associate sort of the middle class with democratization, but it's possible that we are in an era where we should rethink whether middle class can, how is it that the middle class can be instrumentalized in de-democratization? Thank you.
Professor Bustakova, thanks so much for that fascinating take on the Capitol insurrection in a global perspective. Before moving to our next panelist, I just want to invite our audience members to put questions in the Q&A function. We'll try our best to ask the panelists the questions. Now I'd like to turn to Professor Kirkpatrick for her comments. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to try to share a portion of my screen here. Can you all see my slide? Yes, thank you very, very much. Hello, I'm Jennet Kirkpatrick, and I'm Associate Professor in the School of Politics and Global Studies here at Arizona State University. Today, I will be putting the violence of January 6th into a larger context of mob violence within the United States. My goal is to provide a historical and theoretical lens that will help us understand January 6th better. I will start though in the present. I will look at some reactions to the mob violence on the 6th. Well, let's try and make sure we can move to the next slide. On this slide, you can read one reaction from Joe Biden to what happened on January 6th. Here, Biden says that the violence was un-American. Many others made similar statements. Senators Susan Collins, Mitt Romney, and Mark Warner said, quote, "The behavior we witnessed in the US Capitol is entirely un-American," end quote. "That's not who we are," Senator Ben Sasse said. Others have emphasized the anti-democratic nature of the violence. Reporting from Mexico City, CNN's Matt Rivers noted that the US's anti-democratic chaos, as he put it, looks surreal from abroad. Organizations inside the US, such as the National Immigration Law Center, denounced the violence as, quote, "an anti-democratic assault." The themes here are that the January 6th violence is un-American and anti-democratic. What these commentators were getting at is that this violence did not match their ideal of America. They also meant that the mob violence did not accord with their ideal of democracy. These commentators meant, I think, that the group that stormed the Capitol lost the election, and for this reason, the mob was against democracy. As someone who has researched American political violence, I am a little bit skeptical about this idealistic view of America and American democracy. For my book, which was published in 2008, I read many historical accounts of mob violence similar to the January 6th event. The book spans American history. It begins with the Revolutionary War, and it ends with an examination of militia groups on the radical right, such as the Michigan Militia. In 2008, the militia movement was one of the most openly violent groups in the US. In between, I did in-depth historical research into lynch mobs on the American frontier, abolitionist violence, and lynching in the Reconstruction South. You can see that my research covered various regions in the US, including the South, the West, and the Midwest. In my research, I found several themes. The first theme has to do with democratic ideals. Many American mobs appealed to a majoritarianism. They claimed that they were the authentic voice of the people. Mobs have also often been understood to express people's will, or more accurately, the local majority's will. Some lynch mobs conducted elaborate public trials, while others wrote constitutions that outlined their self-government. So while mobs are often spontaneous, some groups are organized in a public fashion and mimicked formal legal entities. A second theme is that the so-called people are acting in place of the government. Throughout American history, mobs have argued that they were doing what government officials could not or would not do. Vigilantes and lynch mobs often usurp power from government officials that they believe were corrupt, unjust, or immoral. Vigilantes and their apologists often referred to the can-do spirit of mobs. They claimed they were virtuous citizens who were taking back power from corrupt authorities. A third theme is that mobs have been racially motivated. Whites have made up most mobs, and mobs have directed their violence against Blacks, Mexican Americans and Latinos, Chinese Americans, and Jews. Victims have included anyone seen as different from the white majority. These mobs believed in a Herrenvolk democracy in which the white majority participated in government. At the same time, minority groups were disenfranchised and terrorized. Their view of democracy was elitist and racist. It posited there was a master race, whites, that was alone suited for democracy. The history of mob violence demonstrates that there are two ideals or visions of democracy in America. We can see both at certain moments in history when they clash. On the one hand, we can see the ideal of democracy of the mob. Mobs tend to think what they're doing is being true democracy or pure democracy. As they see it, groups or people are the genuine source of legitimacy in a democracy. This ideal tends to emphasize participation and the physical presence of the people or of the crowd. True democracy tends to focus on majoritarianism. It values the crowd over institutions and officials. Moreover, though there are some exceptions, this ideal of democracy has led to profound racial injustices. There is an alternative view of democracy. It's on the right-hand side of the screen. One that mobs often dislike. Constitutional democracy is in many ways the opposite of true or participatory democracy. It relies on representatives, experts, and institutions. Constitutional democracy adheres to the rule of law and tends to try to stick to agreed upon rules. Constitutional democracy has made great strides to correct racism and exclusions. At the same time, it too has had a long history of racism and exclusionary civic practices. In closing, I would like to revisit the notion that the January 6th mob was, quote, not who we are. The politicians and commentators making these arguments wanted to condemn the violence. They wanted rightly to separate America from Confederate flags, gallows, and lynch nooses, all of which were visible in the January 6th event. These are shorthand visual references to the violent suppression of Black Americans and other minorities by white mobs during Jim Crow and the frontier. As this brief presentation has suggested, however, mob violence also has a long history in the United States. Though we might not like it, it is who we are. Also, this violence has been justified with democratic language and ideas. We can see a similar tendency in the January 6th insurrection. The crowd thought of itself as patriots, those who wanted to take back a stolen election from a corrupt government. Democracy, they argued, had been cheated. They said they were taking over the people's house or our house. Many in this group ascribed to Herrenvolk conception of democracy in which whites should, they believe, rule over others. To borrow from Carl Schmitt, this was democracy by acclamation. My goal here is not to defend or legitimate the violence of January 6th. Claiming democratic legitimacy does not mean that mobs were right or just. As I have tried to show, mob violence can be unjust and wrong. There is lots of historical evidence to show that this is true. At the same time, it is essential to understand the role of democratic ideas in mob violence. As I have shown, the mob's view of true democracy is not the only ideal of democracy out there. America has a long and well-established tradition of constitutional democracy, which can be understood as a competing ideal of democracy. Thank you for your attention, and I hope this brief presentation was educational, and I'll stop sharing my screen at this point.
Thank you so much for that really provocative and enlightening presentation. And we will now turn to our next panelist, Professor Neuner, also in the School of Politics and Global Studies.
Thank you, Victor. So I'm a political psychologist by training. And so I want to talk broadly about some of the kind of mass phenomena that we should relate this back to, then also specifically about some ways of thinking about the events of January 6th specifically. And so I think the first thing to note is that we should not see this event in isolation. And a question that's already come up is this something that exists on the left and the right? And so I want to start off by talking about anti-democratic attitudes and also anti-partisan attitudes. So both negative partisanship towards the out-group, but also the recent concept of radical partisanship. So really where 10 to 15% of the population don't fully reject violence against the other group. Because I think we have to think of anti-democratic attitudes and anti-partisan attitudes here together. And so it's important to note that this exists on both sides of the aisle in terms of the attitudes. So at the attitudinal level, we see both that Democrats and Republicans reject some form of democratic attitudes, be it support for strong leaders or the idea that sometimes you can't trust the election outcomes. And then also both Democrats and Republicans harbor some form of resentment towards the other group. So we know this is traditionally measured by whether or not they would be happy with their family members marrying somebody from the out party. But even though, even further, the idea of not condemning violence against members of the other party. Now, what is different then is how those attitudes translate into action. So both how do anti-democratic attitudes translate into participating in the mob, or how do negative partisanship kind of translate into violence towards the other party? And a big part there is this idea of elite rhetoric and what can trigger these attitudes, not just being latent, but actually leading to potentially violence. And so one of the main factors, and I think why many people have spoken about this in the context of white supremacy, is that we know that partisan animosity is especially strong when it is linked with racial animosity. And so what has happened in the US is that partisanship and racial considerations have become intertwined, which makes those kind of cultural divisions much stronger and much more pertinent. And so it's very different if you have conflict over redistribution or economic issues, but once it touches on ideas of race and multiculturalism, those ideas get a lot more entrenched and a lot more likely to potentially lead to negative affect and potentially violence. And so what are some of the big predictors of kind of moving away from just these attitudes to potential violence? So one part is simply status reversal, or when people are feeling that they are at a loss, then they're more likely to move to violence. And so this fits nicely with the QAnon conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories are for losers is usually what we think about. The idea that you make up fantastical beliefs about the out party if you're not doing well, because that's an easy way of rationalizing away why the party that you believe had no reason to win the election because they're such bad people, you start dehumanizing them. And once you start dehumanizing the out party, it's much easier to think about violence in those terms, because if you're thinking of your political opponent as less than human, then it's much easier to make that step towards violence. And so a big trigger is election loss. So we know, for instance, the measures I spoke about, how people have radical partisanship and don't condemn violence against the out party, that really grows in situations where people have experienced loss of an election. And so we have triggers not just of clear elite rhetoric, but also kind of the losing the election. And so many of us have heard about the big lie and this idea of linking January 6th to the idea of losing the election. And I think it's important then also to take a step back and consider the motivations here. And there's many different motivations. What I mean here is when thinking of January 6th, we have to think both about motivations of some politicians and also motivations of people in the mob, because it's too easy to look at it and see one monolith. But we had side by side people in anti-government militias, such as the Oath Keepers, for instance. But we also had groups such as the Proud Boys, which are much more aligned with white supremacy. But you also had simply people who believed in fantastical QAnon beliefs. And then you also had people who were potentially just there to hear Donald Trump speak, and then kind of were part of a mob that moved towards the Capitol. So I think it's difficult to kind of put those all together because they have many different motivations. On the other hand, we also have different motivations about why people were sustaining this. So was it just because people were upset with losing the election and trying to rationalize it? Or is it part of a bigger political movement where talking about election fraud allows you to enact some anti-democratic reforms? And so this is not just in isolation, but talking about the election being stolen is now paving the way in many state houses to additional voter suppression laws. And so it's not just these events in isolation, but the bigger lie is such that the idea of talking about the election being stolen is a political tool that is being used beyond that. And so questions have also arisen about why are some politicians not breaking with this? And I'm sure I've seen some questions come up already about, okay, why are people going along with this? What would it take for Republican leaders, for instance, to disavow some of this? And I think the motivations there are clear in terms of many politicians nowadays are scared of their voters. And so their voters usually are not the voters in the general election, but the voters during the primary. And so Professor Bustakova was talking about comparing this to the far right in Europe, for instance. And the one big difference that really sets the US apart from many other systems is kind of our system of government and elections. And if this were in any other country, it would be like 15 to 20% of the population. And in a parliamentary system, you could constrain those. But in a system that is a two-party system, what really happens is that you get locked into those dynamics because especially through primaries, you can't really break out of it. And so you become beholden to some extremist elements in parties, and then those get kind of further entrenched. So I'm sure we're going to talk a lot more about some of these topics, but I just wanted to kind of start off with understanding both the underlying attitudes, but also what it takes to kind of activate those attitudes.
Professor Neuner, thanks so much also for your really insightful presentation. We also have a fourth panelist who I don't believe is able to join us. Is that right? I don't think Professor, our fourth panelist is here. In case she shows up, we'll find time to have her speak. So in the meantime, I'd just like to first ask our three panelists if each of them have any questions for each other in terms of the intersection of your three presentations, anything that the three of you may want to ask of each other before we open it up for questions. No obligation at all. Okay, thanks to all three of you for each of your, unique perspectives on the Capitol insurrection, which kind of provide a different viewpoints to understanding it and also finding a way forward. So I would now like to go to some of our questions in the Q&A chat that I'll select. The first question is regards Professor Bustakova's presentation in which she cites examples of far-right mobilization. And the question is, do the panelists see any concern with the emboldenment and violence of far-left mobilization? Is that of concern or worth of academic review? And just to put some context, we know that former President Trump would often talk about that and Antifa and trying to make a moral equivalence between a far left and far, like the violence on both sides of the political spectrum. So I'd like to ask the panelists if to respond to that question.
So I will briefly, no violence is justified on the left, right? And this is a panel of January the 6th, which was, a far-right event. But I consider this dynamic in a work that's not about the States, but in Eastern Europe. And the name of my book is Extreme Reactions, and it deals with this dynamic of the two poles of the political spectrum, which can be political, but it can also have form of political movements in which in which we need to think about implications of what it means if one of the poles mobilizes, in a significant way. And so certainly the fact that the left mobilizes in a violent way affects the mobilization on the far right, and the mobilization on the far right certainly has implications for the mobilization on the far left. And that's an excellent question. I think, I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Thanks so much for that answer.
I just wanted to add in terms of if we just look at, we have violence on both the left and the right, but if we look at kind of incidents, then we see that at the moment, far right violence is more prominent. And so I think what we often think then is we think back to this idea of Antifa and far right violence. I think what it comes back to is why do we see one more than the other? It's again linking it back to kind of the discourse of national elites. And I think there's a distinction, as I mentioned, that there are these anti-democratic and potentially partisan violent beliefs across the political spectrum in people. The question is, to what extent do they become activated? And I think that's where we see the asymmetry nowadays, where one party is more willing to to nudge that on than the other. And so I think maybe it's because of the context in terms of the recent violence we've seen was in the context of an election loss and kind of different motivations, whereas we see reaction to police violence is slightly different. But I think it's this idea of, it's not just whether or not those people exist with these beliefs, but that they're being differentially activated. And so a lot of our emphasis has been kind of what is the role of party leaders in tamping down those, for instance, of politicians disavowing people. And we've seen differences between President Biden and President Trump, for instance, in what they do when confronted with violence on their side. And so I think that is an important aspect of this, is the interplay between the mass level and the elite level.
Okay, interesting. Any other response? Yes, okay, Professor Kirkpatrick, thank you.
Sorry.
No, that's great. That's why we're having the roundtable.
Yeah. I would jump in and say, I think there's been questions on the Q&A about left and right violence, and that's true. And it's, it happens on both sides. And you'll notice that one of my examples was abolitionist violence, and that's violence on the left. So those were abolitionists who were freeing fugitive slaves who had been captured and were going to be returned to slavery. And the groups broke into jails and got those people who had been arrested out. They broke them free. So there's definitely violence on the left as well. And the term mob violence is just a standard one in the academic literature. It really doesn't have it shouldn't have a negative connotation. It just means a crowd, basically. It means a group of people. So you have it on the left and you have it on the right. And I guess I would just add on to what Professor Neuner said of, it's also about those political ideas, and how those are activated, and what kind of foundation is being laid on the left and the right about the vision of democracy, right? Because I think in one thing that Professor Neuner said, it's like, how do we move from, thinking about, gee, I, might be against these people, this out party, to actually being violent against them. And I guess I would just really underscore the role of ideas in that context, and the way that different groups, and on the left and the right again, and the foundations that are laid not just by leaders, but also by all sorts of activists throughout movement politics about what constitutes a good democracy. And so we see different kinds of appeals being made on at different places in the political parties and in different parts of movements. So, but I think it's very important to think about how's the violence being legitimated around democratic ideas, and that it's not just about, I think, your I mean, it can, I think, of course, it can of course be about status and identity. I think that plays a big role, but it also is related with these ideas about what do you think democracy is, and what are your leaders telling you democracy is. Those are very powerful motivators, and for better or worse, political ideas have been enormously influential throughout American history, but also throughout world history. So I guess I would just say we also have to think about the role of ideas.
Okay, thank you so much for all those answers. I have a question here from a professor in Northern Ireland who's asked, the context for the question is the following. In his discussion with his American politics students here in Northern Ireland, is whether the resurgent white supremacist reaction playing a part in electing Trump and culminating in the Capitol Hill riots might eventually yield to what he refers to as a third reconstruction following from the post-Civil War and civil rights era attempts to resolve American a problem of racism in America. In other words, might modern America's democratic nadir trigger a more comprehensive attempt at confronting and transcending the country's racist legacy? So where do we go from here? And I'm likely going to ask another question along those lines as well. Who would like to take that first? Professor Kirkpatrick, would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, if I think if I understood the question correctly, it seems like is there the potential for this to be a refounding moment for it? I mean, in American politics, we often think of in American political development that the beginning of the American experiment is not just with the Revolution or the writing of the Declaration of Independence or even the Constitution, but we've had other founding moments. For instance, after the Civil War, the New Deal, these are big things where we've gone through big shifts, and especially after the Civil War, a refounding, more firmly, not perfectly by any stretch, but more firmly founded in an idea, a vision of racial justice and racial equity. So I think the question is getting to, is there the potential for that here? And I do think there is. I mean, I think we're at a crossroads, and the question is, can we harness this concern and energy and actually, again, in terms of democratic ideas, think about who is it that we are as a nation? I think the idea that people saying this is not who we are around the January 6th event, they're trying to be aspirational. And one of the comments in the chat made this point, and I think it's a great one. And that's, I get that they're trying to be aspirational. So I think they're trying to say this isn't who we should be. I guess I just don't want to erase the injustices that have happened in the past, just for that aspirational moment. But I am hopeful that we could turn this around and think about who are we as a nation, what constitutes our union together, what are our shared values, and how do we relate to one another, especially around the democratic ideal of equality. How do we make that a reality? So I think there is potential. We've done it in the past, and on an optimistic note, I know my presentation was kind of pessimistic. I didn't mean to be a total downer, but I think there is that potential here, and I would welcome that conversation and that opportunity.
Thank you for that hopeful note as well. Hope is a good thing. Professor Neuner, Professor Bustakova, would you like to weigh in on this question? You don't have to because we have other questions as well, but you're most welcome to.
No, that's fine. I just saw in the chat one question that I thought was interesting. It was just on the top of my mind, so I wanted to respond to that. That's the idea about the comment I made about parliamentary democracy, and whether parliamentary democracy is just really kind of then playing down the role of some groups. And I think on the one hand, there's the mechanical idea of that what happens is that a group that's 20% of the population will have less influence in that system. But I think more generally, what I was thinking about is that you have less antagonism between the parties. You have less partisan dehumanization if your kind of potential partisan animosity is split up between 4 other groups that are that have differences over different ideological, be it transportation policy. Whereas in the US, if you really have only 2 political groups, and then those 2 political groups get imbued with racial and cultural differences, then you don't see your political opponents anymore as just political opponents, but you see them as cultural opponents. And so what that then leads to is entrenching those ideas. So it's not so much about kind of the structural mechanisms of what does parliamentary democracy do, but rather it divides up these political groups into groups that see each other more as political enemies rather than like cultural enemies. And so I think there's some small mechanical aspect to it as well, but it's more about the kind of what it does to our understanding of the other side in politics.
Yeah, we'll just chime in a little bit because I know there are a lot of questions in the Q&A. I'm not optimistic, you know, I'm not an optimistic person. And, you know, I would use 2 arguments actually made by Professor Neuner's and Professor Kirkpatrick's presentation, why I think this is just a beginning. And, you know, so I don't believe there will be reconciliation for 3 or 4 reasons. Number one, what Professor Neuner was saying is partisanship as a new identity. This is extremely strong and entrenched. You don't see your opponents as political opponents, but as traitors. You know, he can speak more to this, but this is the partisanship is at such high levels in the US politics. You know, how do you overcome that overnight? Number 2, you know, what Professor Kirkpatrick was saying, you know, Biden's reaction, this is not America. Of course, this is America. You know, where do these people come from? So it seems to me like the gut feeling is to swipe it under the rug. And, you know, maybe it's partly related to the fact that you know, you don't want to be angry at upper middle class real estate agents storming the Capitol. I mean, that these, you know, there's a certain, you know, racial aspect to socially accepting the rioters. And I think that might play some role. And, you know, we see, you know, the trends, you know, you see that the Republican Party is going to stand behind Donald Trump in the impeachment vote. That doesn't give me any hope for like really digging deep into racist legacy. So the proof is in the pudding. And finally, you know, I don't want to drag COVID into everything these days, but COVID will, you know, crises destabilize party systems and usually don't bring good things. The 2008 crisis, you know, heightened partisanship, polarized, the migration crisis. I mean, the COVID will just make everything so much worse. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. We have a lot of questions, so I'm trying to get a diverse range of views and questions. This is a question for Professor Kirkpatrick, but everyone should feel free to weigh in on this, is that in the context of domestic violent extremism, do you think that perpetuating the myth that this is not who we are does more harm than good in a practical sense? In other words, can aspirational rhetoric be more useful than honest accounts? I'd imagine both are needed in different amounts depending on the specific context, but I'm interested in your thoughts. I open up that first to Professor Kirkpatrick and then to the whole panel. And so this is, you know, also kind of fits into a number of questions about where do we go from here and how to bring the nation together, if that's even possible, and the kind of role of rhetoric and even hope and aspirations. And that was kind of also balanced again against the need to look at and understand our history, right? So I hand it off to you, Professor Kirkpatrick.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. It's a great question, and I really appreciate it. I mean, I think, you know, as I said, I think I'm a little less pessimistic than Professor Bustakova. A little bit. I mean, I do hear what you're saying about sweeping things under the rug and everything like that. And so I think there is a balance. To go to the question, I mean, I think, how can we move forward with an aspiration of who we want to be without fully recognizing the injustices that have been done in the past? I don't understand how we could do that. You know, like we have to fully appreciate the wrongs that have been done throughout our history. I see that as a way to get to the positive moment, to the aspirational thing. I think, again, sweeping it under the rug is the wrong approach, because if your family has been victimized in this way, if you have been, in your history, have suffered violence at the hands of, you know, of a white mob, you know, how do you say to that person, move on with this good vision, without a full reconciliation, like an understanding of what happened and a real appreciation of it? And I think we're having a conversation in this country around, for instance, reparations. I've taught about reparations in my American political thought class for years, and I have argued with students about reparations for years. And you know, it's becoming a more mainstream conversation. And this is very much in the idea of thinking about what has been done in the past, what has been done in the recent past around redlining, you know, not just around slavery and injustices like that and Jim Crow, but redlining and more recent practices that have really economically disadvantaged people of color, but Black people in particular. And so I think we're having, you know, again, conversations I've been trying to have in my classes for years, and maybe some of you in the chat are from my classes, and you know, you could attest to the fact that, you know, nobody wanted to talk about it before, and now people are a little bit more open to it. So I think both moments are necessary. I think we have to understand what happened and the injustice of it in order to move forward and have a conversation about how we can move forward.
Fascinating comments, and this is sowing the seeds for another roundtable on the role of accountability in U.S. history, reparations, impeachment trials, truth commissions, what have you. But this is an issue I and others study in transitional justice, and I focus more in a global context, and am underscoring and understanding the importance of also understanding our complex history. So I really appreciate those comments, Professor Kirkpatrick. Others on the panel who want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about a different aspect of it that also links up to another question, and that's the more immediate question. Yes, we can't lose sight of that, but also, what is the ideal for this call for unity? And this is not who we are in this moment. And I think part of it is really trying to dampen this impact as it stands in this moment, where we're at a situation where it could really go in both directions. And so what is needed, as I mentioned, is the activation has been asymmetric. And so what we need is leaders to turn around and say, actually, this is not who we are in this moment, to kind of stop that violence and to get people. And we know that the majority of people look back at the events and say, this is not who we are, these people are terrorists. But it also means that we need to de-escalate. And I think de-escalation is just one part of it. And I think you can de-escalate while still saying, but there are these structural things we need to deal with. But in this moment, we need to de-escalate. And that gets to one of the questions I saw in the chat about, do we see these different levels of violence between the left and the right? Might it have something to do that one side is more aggressive? And what's really interesting and fascinating is that, so the research that has looked at radical partisanship shows that the main predictors of radical partisanship are trait aggression, so just whether people are aggressive people, and whether people are strong partisans. And interestingly, there's no variation across the parties that exists on the left and the right-hand side of the spectrum. And so there's maybe surprisingly, no real differences in trait aggression between the left and the right. What differs right now is kind of the activation and the activation potential. And I think that's why it's so important to highlight elite rhetoric as one way of overcoming this, because we do see these latent attitudes across the board, but we don't see everybody acting on them. And a big part of that is kind of the message that leaders are sending. And so understanding that leaders have the ability to kind of walk this back a little bit is important, and the responsibility as well.
Yeah, I just want to chime in on two issues. I, really enjoyed the answers of the four panelists. I think there are two aspects. In comparative perspective, what sets the US case apart is the gun ownership. So it's, access to guns is very easy here, which, escalates the danger of this violence. So this is probably not going to happen, but it might be a good thing to think about, the prevalence of guns. And the second thing is, this is what in Europe, a lot of the radicalized mainstream parties are doing, and it's a winning formula. And they combine very aggressive social welfare policies with nationalism. And I think if you want to go at this, and I know this country, is not so much on the left and as Europe is, even though public opinion surveys suggest that actually there is a lot of appetite for. So you have to pick up on redistribution and welfare, before the other sides gets to it. And again, in the US, this is a different thing. But I do think one way to move forward is to radically rethink social welfare policies, redistribution in the United States, and some of the ideas about debt, student debt, and alleviating poverty, child hunger. I mean, it's a huge problem. So just politically probably not feasible, but I think that might be a way forward. I don't think it's going to happen, but I think it's a big pink elephant in the room as well.
Okay, thank you, Professor Bustakova. Thank you all for weighing in on those questions. I would like to now ask a question of a former student of mine from 12 years ago. And she asked, regarding former President Trump's involvement in the riots, the right side, the right, quote unquote, side suggests he used passionate language, while the left side says he incited the violence. Are there other examples in US history where a president behaved in a similar way? And is there a clear-cut academic answer as to his actions? I'm assuming that last part of the question regards if that is impeachable incitement of insurrection. But the first question, in terms of historical parallels there in the actions of other US presidents. Does anyone on the panel have an answer?
I don't, is the question about whether you have, we haven't had a group charge or storm the Capitol before, so this is new. So we haven't had a president do that in particular, for sure. I'm trying to, so I think that is unprecedented. But I think the general question about have we had a president who's appealed to crowds and rallied them up in the same way, I guess, is that the question?
Sure.
I'm gonna punt on that one. I think you could answer it a couple of different ways. First of all, I don't think we have great historical evidence about all the presidents and what they've done. Because now we have social media, so we have much more information about what presidents are doing, and we know exactly what happened in that event. But I don't think we've seen anything as direct as that before in the past. That's my quick and dirty answer. I'm really trying to go through my my head here and think about, we may have some people actually in the who are online, who are watching, who are more expert in this than I am and can weigh in, but I think that is a little bit unprecedented, and that's why this response of the impeachment and that going on, that's a different kind of motivation. And I think Professor Neuner is really touching on this a lot, the important role of leadership and the role of leadership, I would say, in ideas and how they are understood. And on that, I wanted to follow up. There was a great question on the chat about how there's anti-democratic, or in the question, the Q&A, sorry, about how there's anti-democratic language too going on now, and people are saying they want Trump, whether he, if he's a dictator or not, and all that. And I think that's a really wonderful point. I think Mariah made it. Thank you so much for that point, because I think it's terrific. And one thing, I just didn't have time in my brief presentation, but I do think there's a big question now as to whether we're shifting to something quite different, because in the 2008, the militia movement stuff that I studied, there wasn't this fascination with one figure. Mm-hmm. And we didn't hear the kind of tight connection between a supporter and a leader. Nobody was too excited about a political leader or president at that particular time. So we didn't see that at all. And I think now we see something else that is different. And I do think it is anti-democratic language that's going on about about the centralization of power in a single person and how important that is. So I just wanted to thank Mariah for raising that. And we may be in a very different moment, actually, where we're shifting out of democratic language into something else. And democratic language is actually being used to propel us to something else, if that makes sense, right? They're using democratic language to even actually talk about anti-democratic form of rule. So again, I just wanted to follow up on that and kind of the centralization of power, because I think it's a very important point.
Excellent point. Anyone who else wants to weigh in on the original question or what Professor Kirkpatrick said? I think we might have time for one, maybe two more questions. I'd like to draw on Lizette's question, who's a student of mine. And in our class, we've been talking about the politics of international justice and the importance of international justice. And there's a multi-part question, but I want to focus on one aspect about what steps can be taken to avoid a negative outlash from the impeachment trial. So before I heard about the importance of a collective memory and accountability for the wrongs in US history. Now, in the context of the impeachment trial, those who are in favor of the trial in Congress speak about its importance, but then there is always the possibility of backlash. What can be done to make this truth-seeking exercise a kind of an agent of a positiveness moving forward? Is that possible?
I think part of it is how the impeachment trial is being framed. I mean, right now we have this idea that members of the Republican Party have already said that they know how they're going to vote. And so if we say it's a foregone conclusion, then that's just going to further entrench it. So one easy thing would be is just for there to be a real trial and a real back and forth that might get people out of their animosities. But most outcomes nowadays, if it falls along partisan lines, is just going to further entrench that. And so it kind of begs the question of what could you do to overcome that? And it would be people to break out of the partisan mold. And so yes, that would lead into one direction in terms of the outcome, but anything that falls along partisan lines is just going to further entrench that, I think.
Interesting, right? So where the Senate is the jury, but the Senate is a partisan institution, not everyone acts in a partisan way. So that is right. It's quite tricky there. Thank you so much. Professor Bustakova, Professor Kirkpatrick, anyone want to weigh in on this last one? I think that will be the last question. I know we have many questions. I think it's total 35. And so unfortunately, we don't have a chance to get to all of them, but any concluding thoughts?
Well, I think backlash is okay as long as it's contained. And I think, Cas Mudde, who's one of the very prominent scholars of the far right, thinks about the far right or the radical right as the radicalization of mainstream ideas. And of course, we should, separate the democratic streak. It's like, I cannot get over that my guy didn't win the election. but we should think about the grievances of the far right and think whether there might be some policies that alleviate some of the grievances, and whether, you know, that's something we can get on board on, have frank conversation about policy grievances that they're bringing on the table. And, you know, if you reject them, at least have a conversation about it. So, but I think as long as the backlash is not violent, there is nothing wrong with, debate, and the US will survive it.
Okay, thank you very much for that answer. Professor Kirkpatrick, you have the last word if you would like it, and then I'll sum up. No?
I'll say we're over time, so I will cede my
Okay.
time to you. There have been some great comments in the chat. Somebody mentioned Andrew Jackson, and I'm trying to, it's like Zoom, you know, you're trying to do multiple things at once all the time, but there have been some really wonderful comments. So thank you so much to everyone commenting in the Q&A in the chat. And I apologize, I wasn't able to get to everybody.
Okay, and thank you to all our panelists. A really, really insightful, important event, and I'm so glad and appreciative of our panelists, the Matt Oxford, and to the nearly 100 people who attended today. There's a lot of very important issues, and I hope that this will be the first of other events that take on contemporary issues in a broad context. So thank you, everybody. And stay tuned to other events, including our event on March 15th with Senator Jeff Flake, who will also speak to issues of anti-democratic violence and the second impeachment trial. So please join us for then. Stay safe, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you for great questions.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.